Hello, listeners. I'm Kathy Fang with Below the Radar, a knowledge democracy podcast. Below the Radar is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh peoples. On this episode of Below the Radar B-Sides, our host Am Johal is joined by Dr. Ira Allen, Associate Professor of Rhetoric, Writing, and Digital Media Studies at Northern Arizona University. Ira is the author of The Ethical Fantasy of Rhetorical Theory and Panic Now, Tools for Humanizing. Together, they chat about living in a system of Carbon-Capitalism-Colonialism, or CaCaCo, AI's disruption to meaning-making, and panicking. Enjoy the episode.
Hello, welcome to Below the Radar. Delighted that you could join us again this week. We have a special guest with us, as we always do. Ira Allen is with us. Hello, Ira.
Hi, Am. Good to hear you, see you, be with you at a distance. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, Ira, why don't we start with you introducing yourself a little bit?
Sure. I am a denizen of Flagstaff, Arizona. I live at 7,000 feet, surrounded by ponderosas, across from a wash that currently has the name Pump House Wash. Lands traditionally inhabited by a wide range of other people, including some Apache and some Diné. And I'm an associate professor of rhetoric, writing, and digital media studies at Northern Arizona University. So I'm ultimately a rhetorical theorist and a political theorist, basically.
Now, Ira, I just saw you at the Sylvia Hotel a few months back as you were traveling through town, and we know each other from both meeting each other at the European Graduate School many years ago. But you have a new book out right now called Panic Now, Tools for Humanizing. Wondering if we can begin with you just talking a little bit about where that project started for you.
Yeah, thanks. So two places, basically. One of the kind of, insights of my first book, which was about what we people who sort of broadly buy some kind of anti-foundationalist, theory about how the world is, some kind of way of understanding the world that doesn't say there are firm foundations. My first book was about how do we navigate that belief while also having some kind of stability in what we take to be the case for our fields of study. And in my case, that's the field of study of rhetoric. And so the first book was called The Ethical Fantasy of Rhetorical Theory. And one of the insights that writing the book gave me or helped me understand better was the sense that you can kind of chunk up most of the constraints in the world into hard constraints and soft constraints. So that first book was about rhetoric or rhetorical theory as the sort of self-consciously ethical study of how symbolic animals negotiate constraints. And so ever since writing that book, I've been all about, in a bunch of different pieces of research, thinking about how we negotiate constraints. For a while, especially with a lot of climate stuff and biodiversity loss stuff, I wanted to be able to sort of assent to the public discourse of these as sort of soft constraints. These are negotiable constraints. Nothing's really that baked in. We can do these things. And it became increasingly clear that a lot of the catastrophes that are stacking up around us, for us, with us, by us, are, to a really large extent, actually hard constraints on what sorts of future can emerge. And so where this book ultimately comes out of is trying to recognize what are the really, really hard constraints for ordinary people trying to navigate a world right now. And so really often when we read a sort of a arduous book about how fucked everything is, the payoff is usually one of two things. Either you get to sort of imagine yourself identified with policymakers or people who have some sort of power in the existing structure of the world, and you get to sort of fantasize that you and they will now, because you've read this book, do the right thing. Or you get to sort of imagine yourself part of, at least at the level of thinking and feeling, some kind of revolutionary vanguard, some kind of this now, I engage with this, and this is the beginning of something else for me and for the world. And what I take to be the hard constraints of our world, of this sort of world that I call CaCaCo, the Carbon-Capitalism-Colonialism assemblage that is our world, the shit company, CaCaCo. One of the hard constraints is that actually neither of those things is going to happen. We won't save this world. And so the book was an effort to really come to terms with what does that mean for regular people. I don't really care what it means for billionaires or for, our sort of captured political elites. What does it mean for just everyday people? How do we navigate that? How do we negotiate that more humanely?
Mm-hmm. Now, of course, we live in a world of crises or polycrises, as you say in the book. And I'm wondering first sort of a question of like, what can writing or what can philosophy or what can theory bring to the table that's maybe a gap or a void currently? Because there tends to be, in Vancouver, we have lots of environmental organizations. You get all the emails in your inbox saying, you have to do this now, send in the letter. It's, constant campaign mode. And that has a purpose in that they're trying to influence political power. But there's also the value of stepping back, taking stock of this big picture and of the multiple crises that are upon us, which can be paralyzing, I suppose, in some sense. And but what is it sort of affirmative, or what is it the process of a possible political durability or a radical outside that can be envisioned through writing, theory, philosophy, rhetoric?
Yeah. I love that question. It makes me think of, remember Slavoj said maybe 15 years ago, don't just act, think, the inversion, his standard inversion, but he's right. Don't just do something, think about it. So I think I have two kinds of answers to that. One is in answering the large philosophical question you're asking, and I'll try and offer a really short answer to that. And the other is trying to answer the practical dimension of that question, which is the essence of the book. So what's the value under conditions of crisis, under conditions of mounting catastrophe, under conditions where we are beset by appeals that are legitimate appeals, not just garbage appeals, good appeals, correct appeals for our action? What's the value in taking a step back? What's the meaning of a certain kind of slowness of thought in that context? And so this is to the philosophical side of that. From my perspective as sort of a reluctant Hegelian, it's about tarrying with the negative, stopping, slowly navigating the coordinates of the world that we live in thought, gives us ways of inventing in that world that we can't see when we're just doing the next thing in the world. And that's true also for activism itself. As long as we're doing things that strike us as the legitimate next thing or a viable thing or pragmatic relative to or realistic relative to the sort of existing constraints of the world, we're really, really limited in our inventional capacities. We're only going to be doing things that make sense relative to this order of the world. Now, in a lot of moments, that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that, right? If things are sort of humming along in some sort of way and what's needed is ameliorative process or what's needed is engagement in a well-defined revolutionary process, you don't really, you need philosophy still, you need slow thinking, but you don't need everybody to be taking stock all the time. In our conditions, though, in the conditions of polycrisis that we absolutely don't have solutions to, and I want to come to that in a second, if we would like the forms of futurity that we can participate in to be anything other than deeply epistemically authoritarian, and then, in fact, practically authoritarian, which is mostly what we're kind of building right now, broadly speaking, then regular people benefit from sort of it's in our collective interest to stop, take stock, be sort of part of a slow, difficult, painful process of reckoning with these hard constraints and being present to them. And that's a lot of what comes to the second piece of the answer. A lot of what this book is about being present with this experience of panic. When you're like, oh my God, I don't know what to do. What do I do? What do I do? Now there's a bunch of people wandering around saying, well, do this, do that, do the other thing. You can do this. And part of what Panic now suggests is, well, actually, those won't work. Not like you shouldn't do, by all means, if you feel called to like work on rejiggering power plants so that they are better able to operate with electrical inputs from solar rather than, turbine-based fossil fuel inputs, by all means, work on that. I'm not saying don't do this. My point is not don't do X, Y, or Z. My point is all of the appeals with which we are showered have underlying them this sort of desperate refusal to really panic. We're like, oh, we don't want to panic. Don't panic. And panic is something a lot of people are already, and by the time this airs, will be increasingly feeling. And so there's two pieces to that. One is telling people not to feel what they feel and instead to feel something else, feel hope, feel empowered, feel whatever, is basically dysfunctional. People do feel what they feel. And so telling them to feel other things is sort of, as anybody who's ever been in a relationship that's lasted any length of time with another human being has learned, you can't tell people to not feel what they feel. So that's the just general practical piece of that. But the more specific practical piece of it that I think is important to the moment is when we tarry with a negative, when we stay with the feeling of panic, what it lets us get to is a sense of, yes, this world is ending. This version, this CaCaCo world, this carbon-capitalism-colonialism organization of resource distribution and metabolization capacities, extractive capacities, circulation, this world is on its way out. And all of the solutions that were offered will not save this world, nor should they necessarily. It's not like this world has been so terrific for most of its inhabitants anyways, right? This has been a hegemonic world that has badly served most of Earth's 8 billion humans. But when we panic at the end of it, those of us who are currently able to consume resources in a fairly hyperabundant way relative to the global population, and we recognize actually what's coming is a future where somebody like me is just able to consume fewer resources. And you can say on justice grounds, well, I shouldn't panic at that. That's a good thing. Well, yeah, that's fine. But people will, and I will, and we all actually have to live with what it feels like to confront a future of diminishing resource availability for we hyper-consumers in the global north. And if we want to confront that in ways that are not essentially just playing out the internal logics of the existing organization of things, but rather open us up to new kinds of invention, we have to start by being present with the panic, by staying with that feeling long enough, tarrying with that sense of a world ending long enough to collectively invent different sorts of possibilities. And that's the ultimate goal of, in my view, like sort of public philosophy or, public scholarship in general is, and I know this is something you and Matt Hearn did in Oh My Friends, like you're trying, at least it's how I understand it, and if you disagree, I'm super interested. But you're trying to digest a bunch of knowledge sets that are sort of esoteric or expert knowledge sets in a way that regular people can do something useful with them for themselves. And that something useful almost invariably hopes to cash out in new collective capacities for invention, rather than just signing on to one of the endless series of petitions or causes or well-structured activism programs within the existing order of the world. Our goal is to invent a new world.
A few things come up for me in listening to you. I remember Anne Dufour-Mantel's book on risk, or we might think about Paul Virilio's work on speed, the ongoing acceleration of the world, but also of its multiple crises. In the theological world, there's a whole history of eschatology and end of days kind of work that has, in philosophy has a history as well. And I'm wondering, what is it about the present moment, or in terms of how you approach your writing in the book? Because I think there could be some people who say, well, it's misanthropic to think, this world is coming to an end, and people have been saying that forever. Like, everyone, take a deep pause, take a breath. So maybe help walk us through some of your arguments in the book. And also, it'd be great to hear also this etymology of the word panic.
Okay, that's three different things that are three big things, but also the heart of the book and the heart of what I care about. So I'm happy to have them. So let me start with the first thing, because I think this sort of deflationary response to hard feelings is a pretty standard protective mechanism for any given normalcy, right? If we think about sort of complex societies as subject to the same general sets of evolutionary laws or patterns that we take most things to be subject to, then we think about complex societies as, to some extent, emergently self-organizing to foster their own sustenance relative to external conditions of resource availability. And so at any given moment, panicking or freaking out or falling apart or opting out, think back to the 60s or the 70s, turning in, turning on, tuning out, tuning in and dropping out. That's always sort of dysfunctional for the order of an existing world. And so the history of people producing superstructural and in a Marxist sense texts that tell other people not to panic and not to freak out and not to drop out and not to do anything radically non-normative relative to the existing order of the world, and don't suppose that this world can end. It's unsurprising that as we move into a period of increasing crises, and that's the second part I'll get to in a second, but as we're in this period of staggered collapse where crises mount and stack in ways that we can't actually sustain this particular organization of world through, it's unsurprising that you'd have an endless series of opinion pieces in the New York Times or in the environmental movement. I mean, you've got people like Michael Mann, who is a good climate scientist, vigorous denier of basic political realities. And I think like that first piece of it, I almost inclined to turn around and say, yes, indeed, people have frequently noted that some world is ending. And equally frequently, a bunch of people who are super invested in their particular personal benefits from that world have produced a great deal of text saying, no, it's not. And moreover, look at you producing more text about how the world is ending. But the flip side of that is, I don't really see what I'm saying as at all as part of like a certain kind of eschatological or apocalyptic tradition. Except maybe in a very sort of light Benjaminian way, right? I mean, which is to say, the end of this world isn't the end of worlds. It's just the end of a particular way of organizing resource extraction, circulation, and metabolization that's prevailed for a few hundred years, basically. And that's given us some things that are nothing to, sneeze at. Penicillin is fucking great, right? It's not like everything about CaCaCo has been horrible the whole time. That's just not true. When I was there in Vancouver, I was there in Vancouver where I drove in my car and it was fucking great. We sometimes want to be like, oh, see, this world is so bad or this world is so good. And where I'm kind of coming from in the book is to say, well, I mean, there's like plenty of pieces of CaCaCo that have been very pleasant for their beneficiaries. Lots of people have written incredibly solid critiques of the sort of moral condition of this world. I'm not really focused on either of those things, not really. I'm just sort of descriptively saying, in an entropic universe, it takes X amount of energy to create Y order. And if Y order does not have a way of accounting for its deferred costs energetically, Y order will not persist. It will, as those deferred costs fall due, Y order will be subject to centripetal forces and disperse in various ways. So that gets to the second piece, which is when we talk about polycrisis, there's lots of things that we can talk about. In the book, I talk about climate collapse, the sixth mass extinction, which we often treat these as though they're the same thing, but in fact, they're two distinguishable processes. They can be disambiguated as processes, and they're sort of horrifying in similar but different ways. But an AI revolution, a revolution in the automation of intellectual products, which is another thing. Incidentally, we've got a big, broad, desperate effort to deflate the hype, which is understandable because there's a giant hype machine, but it's also like, well, deflating the bad guy's hype isn't actually the same thing as trying to understand what is the case. Anyway, so we'll come to that in a sec. And then the fourth piece I look at is the novel chemical crisis, which is something we basically tend to overlook. So we think about individual chemicals. We're like, oh, PFAS. Now we're talking about that. That's bad, which is true. And before that, we talked about BPA for a while. And all the way back to Rachel Carson, we've been talking about DDT. But each of these chemicals is one of roughly 500,000 novel chemicals that this CaCaCo civilization we are has synthesized in the last 100-ish years, a little bit more. And part of Rachel Carson's point back in Silent Spring, which tends to get overlooked because people think so much about the DDT-ness of it or the pesticides or the whatever. But her point was really about the way when you introduce novel organizations of matter into the Earth system, the weathering processes, the geologic processes, the ways of sort of accounting for that as an Earth system that our sort of Gaia sphere has had, they operate on different time scales, and we're able to produce ever more novel synthesize ever more sort of chemicals, raid the periodic table in ways that we only belatedly, even if we try to forecast the consequences, we only belatedly recognize them. Anyways, that's the four pieces I talk about as part of the polycrisis. You could talk about the looming threat of nuclear war. You could talk about from an American and Canadian perspective, de-dollarization in the global economy, what that's going to mean for our ability to consume resources here in the sort of colonial metropoles. You could talk about a looming economic crisis, blah, blah, blah. The point is just to say polycrisis broadly names a set of conditions that mutually interfere and amplify, that collectively impose what feel like for us, if we're not thinking about it very carefully, new costs on our system, our organization of the world, but are in fact, for the most part, deferred costs. These aren't new costs. These are costs that were treated as though they were externalities, but turned out, in fact, to be deferred costs. And those costs are now falling due in ways that amplify each other in positive feedback loops, such that this organization of world can't persist.
The tar sands of Alberta are a great example of a lot of externalized costs that will come to bear far past the extraction of tar sands oil. Ira, I was going to ask you, before I come back to some more questions around the book, including, implications, say, of AI and technology and other pieces, but in the time that you were writing the book, like not only was there a pandemic unfolding, but you were also going through some major health issues of your own. So I'm wondering if you could speak just a little bit to the book and how much of your own personal health situation and the pandemic also inflected some of the passion behind the arguments in the book.
Yeah, for sure. So basically, I had a terrible snowboarding accident. I hit a tree. I broke 18th vertebrae. I came to on the ground and paralyzed below here. And I didn't know it at the time, but one lung was in the process of collapsing. The other was filling up with blood. I was sort of like weakly, hoarsely shouting, "Hey, help!" Nobody could hear me. It was really a very negative experience. And so I was, I was ultimately life flighted down to a hospital in Phoenix, and I had a spinal fusion, and then slowly over the course of a couple months, relearned to walk. And thankfully, I mean, I've been very, very fortunate in this. I've been able to regain a lot of capacities. I'm still, permanently disabled in some ways, but I've been able to do just a whole bunch of shit in the ensuing years. That's about 4 years ago. And the reason I've been able to do a whole bunch of shit is because of the organization of resources that preceded my accident. So in other words, I had a personal catastrophe that was truly catastrophic, like absolutely phenomenally fucking bad. And my ability to persist in the world in ways, or reorganize myself in the world in ways that sort of deepen my commitments to different kinds of core values, was itself predicated on a prior organization of resources. I had, through my university job, exceptionally good insurance. I have a close relationship with my partner, who is also a, clinical psychologist and neuroscientist, was able to do a literature review on literally, and did everything anybody suggested for me. I had a certain amount of social capital in the hospital itself. My mother, who was a nurse, came and stayed with us here at our house after I came out of the hospital still for about a month. And so in other words, you can look at my accident and be like, oh man, that's a really bad thing. You were really lucky. And that's totally true. It's a really bad thing. I was really lucky. But the form of luck that was available to me was predicated on a certain organization of resources that is absolutely not universalizable. And this is the important thing that I take out of that, and the way it sort of shapes my thinking about this book. The question of what's available after catastrophe depends enormously on how we organize resources during periods of hyperabundance. Now, the part where I was really lucky, like the lucky part, is not so much in the recovery from the accident. It's in the organization of resources available to me after the accident because of before the accident. It's not like I made a shitload of wise choices in my life and thus I had a bunch of resources available to me. It's that I was fortunately positioned in the world in various ways, and that fortunate positioning in the world made those resources available after my personal catastrophe. But I think there's a lesson that we can take from that sort of experience that many of us have had. I know you've had some of that experience yourself, which is that how we organize resources prior to catastrophe determines to a very large extent what's possible after things fall apart. Now, in this particular case, in my particular accident, it's mostly just fucking luck, right? It's just blind luck, fortune, CaCaCo distributing things well to me. I'm a white, straight man who was fortunate to have a job and blah, 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 right? These are all the case. But the question of how do we intentionally organize our resource extraction, circulation, and consumption processes now? How do we personally participate in all that now in ways that will make better capacities available to us after things fall apart a bit more, which they will? That question is actually something anybody can answer in any given locality in the world, right? And you can think about that in really simplistic terms. Like if you live in the United States, on the Gulf of Mexico, or certain parts of the southeastern coastline, Atlantic coastline, you should probably move. You should probably actually move pretty fucking quickly because it's going to be very hard to build community relative to the level of catastrophe that is coming to those places. And that's true for lots of places. And there's lots of places people can't move from. It's not that people can just move, right? But you should, but you can't. Same thing's true for, say, Jakarta, which between subsidence and sea level rise is substantially flooded in chunks of the city already. And so when we think about how do we, in our little worlds, not we, the grand we of policymakers who are theoretically going to do the right thing, but are definitely not going to do the right thing because we don't actually have political economic technologies within CaCaCo to make this be different, and that's the hard constraint here. We don't have, and I'll say it again, we don't have political economic technologies to avoid hitting the tree. We are going to hit the fucking tree. And so what that means is anybody who can see that right now, anywhere, again, whether you're in Jakarta or you're in Flagstaff or you're in Vancouver or you're in rural Louisiana, wherever, the question becomes, relative to the resources that I'm currently able to metabolize, relative to the relations that I currently have in the world, how can I organize my metabolic capacities in community with others in ways that essentially promote humanizing under harder conditions, promote richer, and this is part of why, as you know, I really love yours and Matt's book, promote richer forms of sociality that essentially preemptively inoculate ourselves against some of the hardening that is going to be the automatic response for many of us when we lose resource access or resource access diminishes.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about technology, Ira. Of course, the kind of acceleration of AI that's upon us already is, of course, backed up on a whole set of technological mediation that's been accelerating for quite some time, since the early 90s and far before that as well. But wondering if you can speak to kind of that aspect of how we might think through the panic of today.
Yeah. So for AI, I think about this a little differently, I think, than a lot of people do. So let me just kind of set the stage as I see it, because this will probably still be the case when our episode airs. There's a broad cultural conflict between maybe three tendencies. There are the AI hype men and women, women and non-binary people of big tech, who are every new thing is amazing, exponential growth, it's incredible, blah, 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 blah. There are the inverse of them who are in or related to big tech, to, tech capital, IP capital, really. What we should call tech capital is we really should call it IP capital, because that's its core organizational force is intellectual property rights. But anyway, so the inverse, the flip side of that coin within that domain is the sort of AI doomists, the Eliezer Yudkowsky, sort of the alignment can't be fixed. And there's a lot of slippage between these two groups. Sometimes the first group is also the second group. So you have somebody like Sam Altman at OpenAI who partially sells their product by saying this could destroy the world. That's like part of the sales pitch. That's how powerful it is. It could destroy the world. So you have then understandably a third group of people, and this includes everybody from scholars like Gary Marcus to academics on social media, who are to everyday people who are just trying to make sense of all of this, who are not part of the commentariat, broadly speaking, who are pursuing some kind of deflationary, like, well, it can't be that. I mean, how big of a deal can this be? Is it really that big of a thing? It's just like a calculator. And I think like all three of these positions are actually somewhat reality-based. The deflationist position, understandably and to a certain extent appropriately, is trying to, and that I should say that deflationist position often includes a wide range of people who are sort of like Sophia Noble, kind of loosely pre-AI's big hype moment in the last few years, but sort of trying to say, what are the core sort of damaging constraints of this much ballyhooed set of technologies? So Sophia Noble's algorithms of oppression, for instance, outlines the ways in which sort of redlining occurs algorithmically as well as just as part of state policy and infrastructure. And I would sort of assimilate a lot of that to the deflationist consensus. All of these are reasonable as far as they go. And this is sort of an unpopular thing to say right now, but people like Sam Altman or even Elon Musk, they're not just idiots. They're not just lying. Yeah, sure, they are also lying to sell products. Of course they are. It's capitalism, of course. But they're not just that. There are actually really big things underway. And people like Yudkowsky and the other sort of alignment hawks, the people who are very concerned about AI alignment, they're also they're not just bullshitting. Their concerns aren't just like nonsense concerns. And so what's, I think, partly hard for people to make sense of with AI discourse is the way all of these positions actually have significant truth in them. They have a subset of reality. What I do in the book is I bracket off all the questions that come from the broad, AGI, artificial general intelligence domain, mostly because we don't seem to be there yet. We may end up there. What that will mean is its own kind of philosophical question that I think is really interesting, but is not necessarily something to panic about, frankly. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. I don't know. I really tried in the book to stick to things that I feel quite confident about. So what I do think is sort of panicable about AI, and the reason in the book that I call it automated intellection rather than artificial intelligence, is the way that we humans, as symbolic animals, can't not process symbols that are presented for us. You've probably listened to that AI conversation between Herzog and Zizek, right? You can listen to that for a really long time.
It's actually pretty entertaining at times.
It's very entertaining. Yeah, there's a fake Seinfeld show that was running on Twitch. It might still be running. It's just sort of continually auto-generated. Very interesting at times. The point is, we receive symbols. It's the kind of animal that we are. We're probably not the only animal like this. There's good evidence that other animals participate in this set of capacities. But this is exemplarily for humans. Humans are a symbol processing animal. And you can produce more symbols more quickly with AI than humanity writ large has ever encountered. And some version of us, has been complaining about how many symbols we have to process for a really long time. I'm not Christian, so I can't remember which book it's in, but one of the books of their holy text is kind of that line of making books there is no end. It's a complaint. There's so much to process. So long before Gutenberg, right? And so we're entering into a phase of human history where the means of dissemination of symbols and the means of production of symbols are all owned by an exceptionally small group of people in the majority shareholder class of CaCaCo. And the rapidity with which symbol production is automated is through the roof. And the incentives, the local individual incentives to participate in that for regular people are actually really high. We all have dimensions of our jobs, unless you are working strictly with your hands. We all have dimensions of our jobs that are Grabarian bullshit work. And Grabarian bullshit work, almost by its nature, demands that we use AI for that. You need to file a report for your 501c3 for your nonprofit entity. Well, have AI produce it. And I'm not actually saying that critically. In any given instance, it is actually not unreasonable for individual people to want to do that. The difficulty is at scale, and this is what I see as a reasonable and appropriate source of panic, regardless of, AI kill everybody, AGI, all that. I don't know about all that. That maybe, but I don't know about all that. What I worry about is the achievement of alignment with the preferences of a majority shareholder class that are directly opposed to flourishing for the majority of global humanity, which I think is very likely. I think that sort of alignment is extremely likely, combined with the extraordinary pace and granularity of production in societies of ubiquitous surveillance, where the symbols that are presented for your assent can be presented in ways that are directly, automatically tailored to you. We're already almost there. We'll probably be there by the time this airs. What that does is it creates a kind of crisis for meaning for an animal like us that can't help but process symbols. You don't have the option to just not process them. And a last point on this concerns, maybe unintuitively, the question of truthfulness. Truthfulness is one of these things that makes language go. as a sort of a functional technology for coordinating across difference. Part of what language depends on is the notion that most people, most of the time, are truthfully referencing. Our ability to make language make sense rests on the notion that, so for me, I have to believe that when you say the sky is blue, you mean that. Whether the sky is blue or not, that you don't have to be right. But I have to believe that there's a you there doing some meaning quite a bit of the time. That's what it's like to be somebody in language. And this is the thing that's going to be completely fucked by ultra ubiquitous AI. The sense of ascriptive intentionality that makes language go, that like makes language function at all as a general proposition for coordinating in the world. I don't see how that can survive AI scaling throughout the dimensions of everyday life, except in ways that are ultimately bad for most of us, because we continue to produce it sort of falsely, and ultimately we ourselves become disposed ever more in alignment with the interests of a majority shareholder class.
Oh, that's fascinating, Ira. Wondering if you can share just a little bit about what are you working on now, or what are you hoping to work on next, and also any thinker, philosopher that you're reading now that you're excited by?
Well, so I'm working on two new books. One is actually picks up on that last thread, is on witnessing. So I wrote a fair bit about truth in my first book, and I've written about it a little bit elsewhere. And most of the like philosophically good, philosophically interesting truth concepts require some kind of projective horizon of continuity. We're like, oh, this will be, for William James, for instance, truth is what works over the long haul. It's almost a communist sort of impulse, right? It's what works over the long haul. And obviously you've written about Badiou and the way that the truth processes responsive to the event operate. They operate in ways that are non-instantaneous, that assume some kind of horizontal world of continuity. I don't think we have a horizontal world of continuity ahead of us. I think we have a horizontal world of discontinuities and fragmenting. And so I'm trying to sort of rethink, how does witnessing serve as a figure for the kind of anchoring that we expect truth and truthfulness to do for us? How do we draw on the resources that we have sort of in language already for witnessing to think about a similar sort of anchor that's maybe doesn't require the same common horizon? And then the other book is about how we write constitutions. So basically, every time somebody sits down to write a constitution, they more or less copy the processes of the 18th and 19th centuries, which is fascinating.
Fascinating.
Because those processes are for a human subject that we are sure does not exist.
Fascinating. And also, I wanted to ask you, Ira, about you spent some time living in Lebanon, and also, a place that has polycrises happening all the time. And I'm wondering if some of that experience shaped some of your thinking around the book.
Yeah, I think for sure. There's no way not to have. I mean, in two different ways. One, it's not like I was not anti-capitalist before I lived in Lebanon, but it really brought home how utterly bullshit everything is in an absolutely new way. Here's one example. Before I moved there, I went through this whole process with the shipping companies, and it's all very official and very paperwork and this and that. It's the standard bureaucracy, right? On one end, it's all the fiction of a rule of law state. Right? It's all what Jody Dean calls democracy as a neoliberal fantasy. It's this fiction of a rule of law state that looks like rule of law because it is mediated by legalistic and bureaucratic processes. And then on the other end, when I want to get my stuff out of the port, it's some guy on a motorbike and I got to give him like $2,500 in an envelope. and on some level, like, that's the nature of the world. Everywhere is Lebanon. That's not Lebanon. Everywhere is that. There's just more or fewer layers of sort of obfuscation between that and wherever one happens to be. And the other piece was just in thinking about Lebanon's been arguably collapsing. I mean, you can date it wherever you want. You can date it all the way back to the Nakba and say that produced a version of collapse in Lebanon or intensified already extant militaristic civil war-ish tendencies, which is arguably true. You can date it to the actual civil war, say 1975, which was never resolved with, I mean, it had the Taif Accord, it had a peace accord, but the peace accord didn't produce a winner. So it just produced a sort of a hypostasis of competing factions. You could date it back to the French Mandate and this kind of constitution that was written by the French for Lebanon that says, well, you're going to be sectarian for now, but eventually you will become, good like the French. Very paternalistic. However you want to put it, you could trace it more recently and trace it back to recent period of hyperinflation when Lebanon's pound lost its dollar peg. Wherever you want to put it, and the Taura that responded to that, Beirut port explosion, etc. Wherever you want to put it, Lebanon's been collapsing one way or another for a very long time. And one of the really interesting sort of ways of thinking about this is for everybody else. If you say everywhere is Lebanon, Lebanon's not like some bad place that does things wrong because they're idiots. That's not at all the case, right? It's not, you know as well as I do, the people in the U.S. and Canada love to look at the Middle East and be like, oh, well, they have all these ancient tensions over there and they just can't resolve them because they're just not good at things like we are. It's like, no, that's idiotic. That's absurd. What they have is sort of a weird combination of beneficiary in Lebanon and extractee position relative to the forces of CaCaCo. And what that weird combination means in practice is that Lebanon can be a failed state or a collapsing state for actually decades and decades and decades. And what that suggests to people living in the global north is don't assume that that's not you. So I think we're and this is, I want to bring the thinker that I've been reading a lot lately too, which is Sylvia Wynter. So I think we're in a process of staggered collapse. CaCaCo as a global kind of coordinating system. And that's going to cash out for those of us in comfortable pieces of the global north quite a bit sooner than most people are expecting. I mean, really so much sooner, not like 20 years from now, not even necessarily 5 years from now. It's already starting to cash out in places, say in the insurance apocalypse or whatever, that will sort of cascade throughout our political economies. But how long you can stagger along for as a failing form of social organization, it's not like just because one identifies the process of failure of a civilizational form, that failure, now it happens, boom, it's done. Now it's, Mel Gibson riding around in a muscle car shooting bikers in the desert. And so I think like part of what
that does sound like a nightmare.
Yeah. And so by contrast, and this is where Lebanon, together with somebody I've been reading a bunch lately, what I really like in Sylvia Wynter is this sense of like becoming human as a praxis, that the process of humanizing is and she like takes up, as a Jamaican philosopher, or post-colonial philosopher, she takes up a set of colonial traditions, Western Enlightenment traditions, and says, well, yeah, there's some pieces of like what tends to be our remit as a species that those get broadly right, but they've never really reckoned with invention. Not really. They've just taken themselves to already be instances of an achieved humanity and like thought about what would it look like for other people to become achieved humans like us. But the real question is one of invention. We have yet to invent a global humanity. And this to me is really exciting. So as we're in the crumbling of our societies, of our civilizations, of our cultures, all the rest of that over the coming years and decades, and For some of us, very, very, very fast, and for others of us, over a decade or three. In that period, what Sylvia Wynter sort of, in my view, enjoins us to do is to be thinking about how do we humanize? How do we renegotiate our sort of mythopoetic tendencies relative to material distribution of resource and metabolization questions in ways that allow for us to, form radically, not just new, but like appealing modes of sociality. And this is at the end of the day what my book, what everything that I'm doing in my next two books, they're the same basic thing. They're all what we will do. We in CaCaCo, beneficiary countries, is we will fail. We will fail to avert catastrophe. We might not fail to avert the absolute worst versions of that, but we are definitely locked in something like climate genocide. We have definitely locked in an enormous amount of suffering for our non-human relations throughout the world. We will fail. We have failed. We have been failing. Within the penumbra of that failure, our sort of charge, in my view, is to leave good artifacts for future people to build with. And so what I'm trying to do in my work and what I'm also trying to do in not just like my scholarship or whatever, but my mode of engagement with my community and my communities where I am human and non-human. And that's something we haven't really talked about a lot, but a lot of this, and this is, again, one more reason why I like your book so much, because so much of what's at stake is modes of friendship in the world around us, wherever we happen to be. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And the more that we can pursue modes of friendship that most deeply carry forward the things that we think matter about us as a symbolic animal, the better our chances of leaving good artifacts for future people to build worlds with.
Mm-hmm. Ira, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us on Below the Radar, and look forward. Hope all of our audience members get out and get the book and read it. Wonderful to have you with us on Below the Radar.
Thanks so much, Am. I really appreciate the chance to talk with you today.
Below the Radar is a knowledge democracy podcast originally created by SFU's Vancity Office of Community Engagement. The Below the Radar B-sides are supported by Vancity Credit Union. Thanks for tuning into this episode with Ira Allen. Find out more about his work in the show notes below. Thanks for tuning in.